The U.S. does not have the right to torture suspected terrorists by Morgan, Cody, Joshua, and Emma. Torture does not work. It has been proven that many times people who are tortured relay false information. People will admit to anything to get the torture to stop. The John Berg case is one example. The Chicago PD detectives tortured African Americans to make them confess to crimes that they did not commit. Former instructor Malcolm Nance says the procedure does not elicit reliable information. It does, on the other hand, generate false confessions. The captive will say absolutely anything and agree to anything to make the torture stop. Many times, false memories or memory loss is included. Fight or flight mode during torture is very common. Your mind is totally focused on surviving. You experience prolonged sleep deprivation in torture at times, and this may cause false memories and hallucinations. There are many alternatives to torture. One reason why we need to use alternatives is that no information gained is admissible in court when the suspect has been tortured. Just like the court case in Mapp versus Ohio, evidence needs to be acquired properly. Torture is against the law and the laws of war. Former U.S. Army interrogator William Quinn said that normal interrogation with a calm, cool environment usually works the best. Reading people's actions, emotions, and tales in an interrogation are always where people do not get hurt and they result in the most reliable information. This portion talks about the constitutional argument against tortures of suspected terrorists by the United States. The Eighth Amendment puts a ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The most obvious constitutional argument is the Eighth Amendment. It puts a ban on cruel and unusual punishment. However, it does not specify what cruel and unusual punishment is. When the Constitution was underway in the 18th century, after the American Revolution, drawing and quartering, which was a form of capital punishment used in early England, was widely viewed in the U.S. as a punishment that was too severe. This was in mind when the Eighth Amendment was included into the Bill of Rights, which was added to the Constitution in 1791. Since the Eighth Amendment has been in place, courts have ruled in various cases over time in a manner that has increasingly restricted the use of the death penalty and other punishments. Torture practices like waterboarding have received similar criticism as something the state should never participate in. It remains legal for the United States, yet no longer practiced due to severe criticism. Allegations of torture of suspected terrorists have also led to the end of the use of waterboarding and other methods of torture, such as the Chinese water torture, cold temperature torture, and white room torture. The Fifth Amendment talks about self-incrimination. The Fifth Amendment, along with much of the rest of the U.S. Constitution, applies to terror suspects as state action is involved. The Fifth Amendment states that people cannot be compelled to incriminate themselves, meaning that people cannot be coerced into confessing to offenses they didn't commit or admitting to certain details. The problem with torture is that it often results in false confessions or misleading admissions, as the suspect will be under pressure to say anything to make the torture stop. Courts have agreed that terror suspects have a right to habeas corpus, which has resulted in several suspects being released for lack of substantiated evidence, even though some did admit or confess to a crime, and much of it was found false upon further interrogation. The U.S. has also used evolving standards of decency. The federal courts have considered what is known as the evolving standards of decency, which accounts for common contemporary opinions on specific subject matters. For example, It is similar to the national consensus argument used in Roper v. Simmons, where the Supreme Court ruled the death penalty for anyone under the age of 18 unconstitutional in 2005. To understand evolving standards of decency, we will use the historical evolution of the death penalty. Several states throughout U.S. history have decreased the number of death penalty offenses. Currently, there are only a few capital offenses, which include first-degree murder, treason, and kingpin drug activity, so major drug smuggling leadership. Throughout history, the courts have turned to more humane ways of capital punishment. Hanging was originally used as a general deterrence method, but in 1830 it increasingly became a private spectacle because people began to condemn public executions. Only 2 states currently allow for hanging as an option for capital punishment. After death by hanging became inhumane in the public's eyes, the electric chair came along in the 1890s and was deemed more humane and efficient than hanging. Nowadays, however, both methods are widely condemned, and preferences have varied in favor of either lethal injection or firing squad. Today, these methods have been up for debate, but we still use them today because they have been proven the most ethical way we know. We can also see that methods for carrying out the death penalty of U.S. prisoners is relatively humane, aimed at not being torturous. Now we must face the fact that suspected terrorists who are located at places such as Guantanamo, Cuba, where there has been an international agreement that they are under U.S. jurisdiction, have the same constitutional rights as those on death row. If this is the case, then it can only be assumed that the U.S. does not have the right to torture suspected terrorists when they are in their jurisdiction. Given how torture has resulted in many false confessions and admissions, it can be argued that torture constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, is prone to self-incrimination, and does not aid in raising our standard of decency towards other humans. There was a time when the death penalty was unconstitutional after the 1972 case of Furman v. Georgia, but later in the 1970s, another case, Gregg v. Georgia, brought the death penalty back, but under stricter guidelines as to not violate the 8th Amendment. The use of the electric chair has declined significantly, and currently only a minority of U.S. states still permit its use, as it has increasingly been deemed too severe and often amounts to torture. There may come a time when a national consensus on use of the electric chair causes it to be deemed unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court, and perhaps the same will happen for the torture observed against suspected terrorists. There are many opposing opinions, and we will look at these opinions in this section. Many people use the term enhanced interrogation techniques instead of the term torture, but in reality, they are using the same techniques to the suspected terrorists, just under a different word, and it sounds more humane than torture. There's also a professor who teaches at Harvard University who believes that we should legalize torture in the United States. He says that the legalization of torture would promote respect for human dignity, insofar as torture would be changed from an inhumane tool of oppression to a last resort tool for saving lives. This is the hard part with his claim, is what constitutes last resort. Many people have different ideas of last resort, and who would be able to judge when a last resort situation is occurring. He also says that people will not abuse the law because we would be able to institute the necessary and appropriate safeguards. He also says the same thing about the domino effect. Because we legalize it here in the United States, we could put up appropriate safeguards, and situations to deter people from creating this domino effect. But the real question comes is, how would we be able to protect these safeguards, or how would we be able to implement them in a safe environment? The United States is associated with these international law conventions. We are a part of the Geneva Convention, the ICCPR, and CAT, the Convention Against Torture. All three of these organizations are against torture. There is a definition listed below of what is described as torture. It talks about pain and suffering and what exactly, but it does not define what exactly is pain or suffering. Many people find loopholes within this definition to ensure that torture of suspected terrorists is considered legal. They use this term torture light for one of these loopholes. Torture light is considered anything that does not cause long-term pain or long-term suffering, such as putting needles under fingernails, which is very, very painful but does not last forever, or sleep deprivation is another example of torture light. These are all certain instances where torture is applied, but it does not cause long-term pain or suffering. There are many examples of how torture is used in the United States, and we will go over how this torture is done. The CIA described a typical questioning method for high-level terrorists. These terrorists are kept in a small space, too small to stand or lie down fully. They are kept awake, damp, and cold, and if they fell asleep, they would be awoken rudely. They are given sporadic meals. When fed, it would be thin and tasteless, and these areas where they are kept, there is no light or noise. These as individual practices are known as torture-light practices, but putting them together is cruel beyond what a human can imagine. On occasion, the prisoner would be given a drug to make them more talkative. Many of these drugs include marijuana, heroin, sodium pentothal, and methamphetamines for the most stubborn of those being held. In Ronald Reagan's farewell speech from presidency, he spoke of America as a shining city upon the hill. He spoke of commitment to human rights and freedoms. Similarly, President George W. Bush stated, "America will always stand firm for the non-negotiable rights of human dignity." Our country has something to stand for. If we let our people torture horrendously those after us, we are no longer a country the world looks to as the epitome of freedom and taking away basic human rights, but we put those captured from our country in a danger now of the same practices. These past presidents speak of the vision of what our country can be. We hope you enjoyed our presentation, and by understanding the information, you will be able to make an educated decision on whether torturing terrorists should be legalized in the United States or not. If you have any questions, please refer to this page and the next one to see all of our sources that we used in this presentation.